Welcome back to a year of Final Fantasy, and we finally arrived. It's time to send off Odin with one of the most massive, expansive episodes I've ever done here on a year of Final Fantasy. And you know what? This is actually episode 50. That is just mind-shattering to me. I did not think I would keep up with it as long as I have, honestly, and we're not even halfway through. So, oh man, this is going to be a long episode. So for all of you troopers that stick it out, thank you so much. But today we're going to be looking at Final Fantasy VI, and there is a ton of stuff to go over. This being one of the most critically praised games of all time, not just Final Fantasy, but ever. So, all right, let's get into it and just sit back and let's talk about some Final Fantasy VI. So if you've been watching this series since the inception of it, you'll know that I detest this stupid numbering scheme that came over to the US. So for the last time ever, at least I think, I'm going to quickly touch upon this number nonsense that Square seemed to want to put the US through for whatever reason. So if you were around the early 90s and into gaming, you probably heard of a game called Final Fantasy III for the Super Nintendo, and it was beloved, like I said, almost universally, and many people have said that Final Fantasy III is their favorite game ever, it's the best game ever, whatever. But really, they were unknowingly misspeaking as they said that, because the US never really got the original Final Fantasy III, at least officially, until the mid-2000s when the remake happened on the DS, and in fact, we've already talked about this. But because of the late arrival of the real Final Fantasy III on the NES, and really Final Fantasy II for that matter, Square decided to skip the localization of releasing Final Fantasy II and III to the US because the NES was basically dead by the time that they would have gotten that out. Instead, they localized the current games of the time, Final Fantasy IV, and what was supposed to be Final Fantasy V as Final Fantasy II and III on the Super Nintendo. So if you're with me so far, Final Fantasy II had some pretty big localization missteps, I guess, as far as translations and scripts go and all of that, and Square wasn't super happy with the final result. And instead of trying to rush out Final Fantasy V, which they already deemed too complicated for the States, they decided to just hold off and wait until the next Final Fantasy game so they can do it right. Well, I mean, as right as they could, I guess. And they took their time porting over the latest and greatest, which was Final Fantasy VI, and then they called that Final Fantasy III, and it's the one we all know and love if you played it way back when in the 90s. So I just want to touch briefly upon some of the localization issues of Final Fantasy III, and that was really due to the Nintendo ethics at the time, and I don't know, I guess Nintendo still actually holds pretty true to those ethics, being family friendly and whatnot. Final Fantasy VI had to conform to the standards of Nintendo, which again was family friendly. Several images were covered to remove nudity, and it really wasn't like a sexual innuendo kind of nudity, but more artistic. Like some of the summons were nude because they focus on like mythology, you know? So think of ancient Greek arts and stuff where everyone is kind of unclothed, but it's not like really sexual in that nature. And Nintendo had to silence some of the profanity, so that was altered as well. And aside from the nudity that they covered up, there were certain sexual kind of playful innuendos, which actually Ted Woolsey talks about. We've talked about Ted Woolsey quite a bit, and this is his words. He says, "There's a certain level of playfulness and sexuality in Japanese games, and that just doesn't exist here in the USA, basically because of Nintendo of America's rules and guidelines. Straight from the man himself that localizes these games, they were put under some, pretty harsh parameters. But still, the game came out fantastic. There were a few other smaller things that they kind of changed around due to text. For instance, Phoenix Downs, that we all know as Phoenix, they actually changed that to Phoenix, Fenix, and there's just a bunch of little alterations here and there like that. It's actually pretty annoying whenever you go back and play. You're like, why did they even do that? But, they did for whatever reason. Anyway, the game was released in Japan on April 2nd of 1994, and with a pretty quick turnaround time in the US on October 11th during 1994. And since then, there's been a bunch of re-releases, and a few of them are actually pretty significant, especially the one from the PlayStation era that was released in the Final Fantasy Anthology collection, which was Final Fantasy V and VI. And this was actually the first time that we got the proper number of Final Fantasy VI, completely getting rid of that stupid scheme that I hate so much. And of course, Final Fantasy V was also the first time that we got introduced to that game officially. The game was actually developed under the director of Yoshinori Kitase and Hiroyuki Ito, and he actually pulled a double duty shift as designer as well. And the producer was, of course, Hironobu Sakaguchi, and the artists were Tetsuya Takahashi, Kazuka Shibuya, Hideo Minaba, and the young Tetsuya Nomura, and of course, Yoshitaka Amano himself. I mean, you can't have a Final Fantasy game. Of course, do I even need to mention it? No, but I'm going to do it anyway. The composer was the one and only Nobuo Uematsu, with honestly one of his greatest compositions of his entire career, in my view, and one especially moving quote that I found from him, which was on the Final Fantasy XIV Battle Tracks album. It said this, which was just fascinating. So he says, "I still remember when, during the launch party for Final Fantasy VI, the notoriously unforgiving Mr. Sakaguchi gave a speech. And the speech said, 'Thanks to every one of you, we have created the best game in the world. No, the universe. Thank you.' I cried. There were many tears on my face, and those tears made me realize how much I had invested myself in the project. I hope that the Final Fantasy games forever continue to be a source of joy, not only for the fans, but for the developers as well." So they were very moved by this. They knew that they had an instant classic on their hands. And what's more impressive to me is that the game was actually just made in a year or so right after Final Fantasy V released. And they had a production team of about 55 to 60 people at any given time. Wow, so I've actually spent enough time for a regular episode on just this introduction. This is crazy to me. Alright, so let's get into the meat of the game of Final Fantasy VI, and that is honestly the story. This time I'm going to have to break my rule a little bit about talking about the story, and that may be the case for a bunch of games going forward, because the things that make these the more recent ones are really the story and the impact that it's had on the players. It far surpasses anything else done at that time, though I'm going to try to hide specific details as much as I possibly can unless I say it's necessary, in which case I'll give you a spoiler warning if for whatever reason you haven't played this game yourself. So Final Fantasy VI to me is a definite turning point in the series, where we have a full realization of story and the classic Final Fantasy mechanics. Yes, Final Fantasy V did almost perfect them, but really you don't know what you can get until you get even more, and Final Fantasy VI surpasses Final Fantasy V in just about every possible way, barring the job system. And not only that, Final Fantasy V was really the last of the classical era Final Fantasy games, in the sense that you're in a pseudo-medieval, high fantasy world. Here in Final Fantasy VI, we get a fully integrated magic and technology system, and with that, we look at one of Final Fantasy's most defining things, and that is Magitech. Magitech shows up all the time from here on out. It did kind of do that a little bit before in the other games, but right now, it is just a full 100% melding of that type of world. Alongside Magitech, we also focus on summons, and they are here in full force, and they are not going away anytime soon. From this point on, they are just so deeply integrated into this game. And again, Final Fantasy had summons before this, and they played kind of a huge part at some particular story elements. Think of like Final Fantasy IV, but here they're integrated into the fabric of the story and really the game as a whole, mechanically speaking as well. And like I said, we're going to see this going forward in the series from here on out. So again, another super mind-shattering thing here is that they have focused so much attention on the story and cast. It's just mind-boggling looking at the older games. This one just has such a vast array of characters. And in fact, it's the largest roster of characters in the series, at least for the mainline games, even to this day. A quote from Yoshinori Kitase really encapsulates this mentality of narrative melding with RPG gameplay. So he says, "Looking at video game design and development up to that point, I suppose that action games, for example, relied on sense and instinct, while RPGs appealed more to reason and logic. What made Final Fantasy series so innovative was the emotion realized from drama within the game, in addition to those other elements. I believe this innovation was more apparent than ever before in the 6th game. This game really brought that creative goal into full bloom." So now I'm going to get into the narrative a little bit. We just can't avoid it in this instance. The narrative of Final Fantasy VI is obviously one of the biggest parts of the game, and the characters we see are the ones that put this game into motion. Story is only as good as its cast, and the cast here is expansive and even better, compelling, at least most of them. And this is the reason why I had chosen to go with a background that lets you see the cast on all of these episodes appear before your eyes. But before we get into the characters explicitly, it's important to mention that this game also does something that hadn't been done before, to my knowledge, in a role-playing game, or maybe at least a video game. So especially in Final Fantasy, There's no single main character in this game. Throughout the narrative, the viewpoint shifts between several different characters, giving narrative time equally, or at least trying to be equal to most of those members. Let's go through our characters for a quick introduction as they appear in the game. So Terra's our first character, and she's introduced as a mysterious young woman born with the gift of magic and enslaved by the Gestalian Empire. So despite Terra being the first character in the game, a lot of people may mistake that this is the proverbial main character, and that just is not the truth. Terra has some amazing abilities that reveal more truth to her, which makes her a very compelling character, but again, she is not the main character. So next, we're going to talk a little bit about Locke, and Locke more or less maybe is your kind of Han Solo type of character, you know, the dashing rogue, good looks, that kind of thing, although that could be debated because we actually have 2 more characters that could fill that spot. But anyway, we'll talk about him in a minute. So as far as Locke goes, the game describes him as a treasure hunter and trail-worn traveler searching the world over for relics of the past. And there's one thing that you need to know about Locke: do not call him a thief. Anyway, let's move on to our next character, which is Edgar, and he's described as the young king of Figaro Castle, imperial ally and champion of the technological revolution. And what they don't mention here, though, is that he is one of the most suave characters in the game, save for another one that we'll talk about soon. And this is my second, maybe, debate of that character being Han Solo. Edgar is incredibly mechanically adept and uses all sorts of tools during battle, and had this a proper job system, he would definitely be considered a machinist. So we can't talk about Edgar without talking about another character, and we're going to do that right now. We're going to talk about his twin brother, Sabin, and he is described as Edgar's twin brother who traded the throne for his own freedom. Sabin roams the wild free as what you might consider to be maybe a traditional monk, and Edgar and Sabin's past are one of the best stories in video games and maybe possibly even literature. There's not a lot of depth, but what is there, it's so compelling and moving that I just cannot even get it out of my mind to this day. The coin flip is one of the most emotional moments in Final Fantasy history. So next, let's talk about Shadow, a so-called optional character, but one of the coolest in the game. He would be our resident ninja, assassin-y type of character if there ever was one in Final Fantasy, and the game describes him in this way. He comes and goes like the wind, swearing allegiance to no one. Hidden behind his wintry gaze lies a face known to none who live. And in fact, Edgar has the best line about him. He says he'd slit his mama's throat for a nickel, which actually got changed in some of the more recent translations, and that's why a lot of people are actually up in arms about that translation that the Game Boy Advanced, I think, did. He doesn't actually have that line in that particular re-release. But anyway, what makes him a really compelling character in the story is that you actually see a very, very large shift play out in his persona as the game moves on. Next, we're going to talk about Cyan, and he's our resident samurai, again if we had a job system. So Cyan's an interesting one, where other characters have a compelling backstory, but in this case, you actually get to experience the things that Cyan is going through, which is just like incredible. It leads to, again, some of the most memorable scenes in Final Fantasy history, but I'm not going to spoil it here. Anyway, the game describes him as a noble warrior of a foreign land. A faithful retainer to his lord and master, he fears not even death. Cyan is one who is honorable and has a pretty happy life whenever you meet him. And, you know, for sake of story purposes, that's all I'm going to say about that right now. Next, we have Gao, somewhat of an interesting character for Final Fantasy as a whole. Gao is a classic raised by the wild type of character that you hear in narratives quite a bit, and he is described as a youth draped in monster hides, his eyes shining with a warm and gentle light. The character is just a totally wild kind of human, and what's really interesting about that is that he doesn't actually speak very much. He shows his emotions more than telling his emotions, and that's always good for a visual medium. I guess he would be considered maybe a blue mage-ish character because he learns enemies' moves on this veldt, which is a wide mesa where all kinds of different monsters roam. Gao doesn't really have any connection to the main narrative, but he does add another key layer to the story from which the eyes of an outsider is trying to do as much as he can to help his friends. Next, we're going to be talking about, honestly, one of my personal favorite characters. I may be biased, but that is Celes, and she's described as a Magitech knight forged by the Empire and tempered in battle. None have ever truly known the woman beneath the general's guise. I tend to enjoy what's known as Gish characters in RPG vernacular, and you don't have to worry about that word. What it basically means is like a fighting mage hybrid type of character. Whenever you meet her, she's in a pretty compromised situation, which brings to mind instantly Star Wars: A New Hope. She has an incredibly awesome story arc of redemption and a compelling relationship with a few of the other characters in a pretty deep way. Finally, she has one of, if not the most memorable cutscene in the history of Final Fantasy, equal with the one in Final Fantasy VII. You know what I'm talking about. So our next character is going to be Strago, and the game describes him as an elderly gentleman who has spent his whole life pursuing the secrets of monsters. Strago has a pretty strong link with the history of the Magitek War that was fought in ancient times, which I'll get into that in a minute. Strago is a pretty old guy. In fact, he's far the oldest character, at least overtly, that we know of, that joins the team. And really, this is the game's official blue mage. Honestly, if there were official jobs, he would definitely take that cake, even more so than Gao, as he's magically inclined as well. So as we've seen, some of these characters come in pairs, and that is what's going to lead us into the next character, which is Realm. Realm is the adoptive granddaughter, and her description reads as, in her pictures, she captures everything. Forests, water, light, the very essence of the things that she paints. This is one of the more unique characters in the franchise. Realm is the youngest at the age of 10, and as her description says, she actually paints things and they come to life. It kind of reminds me of the Kirby's Adventure boss on the NES, if y'all even know what I'm talking about. So next up is Setzer, and he's described as a gambling vagabond who finds freedom from society's narrow views of morality aboard his airship, the Blackjack. Setzer is your resident cool guy that kind of everyone enjoys. So in those ways, I would actually also debate that he's the more Han Solo type character. But honestly, maybe even more than Han Solo, he feels like Gambit from the X-Men. Next up, we have a pretty special one. For the first time in Final Fantasy, we actually have a playable Moogle character named Mog. So there's actually a little useless trivia about myself, about how stupid I used to be. I actually thought that the race were called Mogs, and I don't know, I guess I got that from Final Fantasy VII or something, but anyway, the race is not called Mogs. Mog is a particular reoccurring character in the series who is a Moogle. Here's how Mog is described. It says he's a Moogle who speaks the words of men and can summon the Earth's power through his dance. So Mog's a pretty interesting character in the fact that you meet him fairly early in the game. He's obviously classified as a dancer, which you can see in the more job-based games that come later, but there's also a little bit of geomancy thrown in there for good measure. Ooh, we're nearly done. So we have the final two characters, which are both optional. First, let's talk about Umaro. Umaro is described as a Yeti with a love for bone carving, stronger than a Gigas, but a bit unruly. He's kind of like Gao in the way that he's wild, and he's really only encountered later on in the game if you happen to go and look for him. It's actually kind of weird. He just seems like a super weird character to throw in. People have data mined, and they showed that he was supposed to be a random encounter and then caught with bait, maybe like you get Gao in your team. Anyway, this seems to be one of the most underdeveloped characters in the game, and it's honestly just a mystery to me why he was included, but hey, why not, right? So finally, we're going to be talking about the last character, and that is Gogo. So unlike Amaro, Gogo's an incredibly interesting character simply because of the fans and the theories that surround him. Gogo is described as a man shrouded in strange clothing, perhaps a woman, perhaps not even human at all. Gogo would be a mime in the traditional job-based games, but anyway, that's not the fun part about him. The mystery of the fun is figuring out maybe who it is, speculating about who it could be. A lot of people think that Gogo is one of the characters that you encounter earlier in the game, and I'm not going to tell you why that is, but I personally subscribe to the fact that Gogo is Gilgamesh. He actually looks a lot like Gilgamesh, and if you don't know who Gilgamesh is or what his big thing is, go ahead and watch our Gilgamesh video on him so you can get caught up. But anyway, like I said, he looks similar enough, and he fits perfectly with the overall lore of the franchise as a whole. So now there are some guest characters, Banon, General Leo, but I'm going to actually have to forego those in the sake of time right now. We can't go any further. We have to talk about the villain, and that villain is Kefka. There is no Final Fantasy VI without Kefka, and most people regard Kefka as the single most terrifying villain in the Final Fantasy series. He appears as a deranged clown type character. I think of maybe Joker from the Batman franchise. Kefka's defining feature is actually his laugh. Once you hear that laugh, you will never be able to unhear it. It just drills into your mind. What makes Kefka this just insane villain? Well, I'm about to break my no spoilers rules. So if you want to go skip ahead, just get to the part where you don't see Kefka on the screen. Here goes. Spoilers, spoilers, spoilers. Get out, get out, get out. Here's why Kefka is the mother of all villains, and he actually succeeds in destroying the world. That is the halfway point of the game. I'm not going to tell you how it ends or anything, but he succeeds in his mission. All right, so, oh my god, that's so many characters. It is a ton of characters, right? While one or two of them may not be compelling, the vast majority of them are. And what's really awesome is that there's, like I said before, no major protagonist. There isn't a single main character, which means that you can actually just switch your party out whoever you happen to have access to at whatever point you are in the game, which is just awesome because you really haven't had that before. You get guest characters and stuff, but normally you're just stuck with your main protagonist. That is not the case here. So we can talk about the story a little bit, at least the beginnings of it. Let's set it up right now. And the game says that thousands of years ago, there was a great war of the Magi, and through catastrophic results, magic was sealed away in these crystalline objects called magicite, which contain the essence of espers. Espers are this game's summons, and there are a ton of them, 27 in the regular game, and then on the re-releases, they had 4 more additions, which is just crazy. It's by far the largest amount of summons that you can get in any Final Fantasy game. So I'm not going to talk too terribly much about the Espers without giving away story plot. So I'm going to have to just leave it right there right now with regards to them. Another point of the story is really this Rebel versus Empire story, and we all know about it. They've actually done it before in other Final Fantasy games. 2 and 4 actually come to mind, as well as the pop culture phenomenon Star Wars. Okay, it's time to end the episode. It's by far the biggest episode I've done, and congratulations if you've stayed way until the end. The length, though, I'm not afraid of. It's a very long cast of compelling characters, has a rich story, a diabolical villain, and excellent music with top-notch visuals. This is really the pinnacle of Super Nintendo in my view. It's easy to see why a vast number of fans cite this game as their all-time favorite. It truly is the point in the franchise where a new era is being ushered in. So as is tradition, let's send off Odin and look towards the next month of July, the month of Ifrit, where the vast majority will be dedicated to the one and only cultural phenomenon that cemented Final Fantasy in its place as being debatably the biggest and most recognized JRPG series ever, Final Fantasy VII. So as always, please sit back and enjoy the opening to Final Fantasy VI as we move into the month of Ifrit. Thank you so much for watching.